Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be talking about Jade Cocoon. This is one of my favorite PS1 games. The story of Jade Cocoon is pretty interesting, but it feels a bit rushed. It feels like they kind of left some stuff out, or things weren't really explained as well as they could have been. And a lot of the lore that sort of explains more about the world is you kind of have to go out of your way in order to get it. So, how the game begins, you learn that you are the son of the Lion of Peril. Peril is the land that you're fighting over, and then there's the village of Cyrus. Those names don't really matter because there's only one real village in this game. As the son of the Lion of Peril, you are going to be a cocoon master. So your father was the cocoon master. He went off into the forest to do God knows what and has disappeared. The village is kind of split over what happened to him. Some think he's a coward and ran away. Others don't believe that. And that is never really settled throughout the course of the game. Or at least the villagers' opinions aren't really settled. So, on the night before you're supposed to get married to a very nice little girl named Mabu, these locusts of the apocalypse, called the Onibubu, penetrate the divine barrier that separates the forest from this village, and they spread dust across the village, and that puts all the villagers to sleep. So this kind of becomes your first big mission. You have to go into the forest, and you have to find the calabash herb in order to wake everyone back up. And that is your mission for a little more than half of the game. So you go through these three forests, the beetle, the dragonfly, and the spider forest. And you meet just the different people that are there. You run into some villagers that are in the forest that it's not really explained how they're able to go in and out of the different forests, but maybe there are multiple keys. That's not really explained, though. Along the way, the village elder and this other incredibly awful shaman come up with a stupid plan to sacrifice Mother Garai, who is kind of like the senior Nagi woman there. Nagi are they're like their own race or their own tribe, but some happen to be in the village with you. You marry a Nagi woman. They're kind of very important to like the cocoon masters and everything. I'll get more into that in gameplay later. So they try to sacrifice Mother Garai because they think she is the reincarnation of the goddess of death. She is, but not necessarily the goddess of death. It turns out all of the people in the forest that you meet have been some kind of a reincarnation of a god, for the most part. Or like the embodiment of a god who's been kicked out of like some kind of a heaven and now reside in the forest in a physical form. It's not really explored as well as it should be. And that's going to be another recurring theme. Things not really being explored as well as they should be. So after that happens, Mother Garai turns everyone to stone except for you and Mabu. Mabu has been turned into a weird fairy thing who goes into a cocoon, and you have to you need to try to gather these 4 elemental gems before she hatches from her cocoon, or something will happen. At least that's what I gathered from it. Yeah, it's kind of strange. So you go into the final forest, which is the moth forest that leads to a temple, and then you need to basically go through the first 3 forests again, but this time they're the netherworld versions, so all the monsters are tougher, and there's actually bosses at the end of them, which is kind of interesting, but it speaks to just how short this game is and how it was probably rushed out. Once you've gone through those and you've collected all the elemental gems that are at the end of these, then you are met by your father, who is the chosen one of darkness, and he fights you because you're the chosen one of light. Once you beat him in a very easy boss battle, you perform the Requiem of Souls, the village is saved, and the game ends abruptly. So the first thing that you kind of notice is the game plays a little bit like Pokemon. Just because you are going into the forest, you're collecting monsters, and you're using those monsters to fight. But you don't necessarily have to use them to fight. You can have your main character fight on his own. He gets weapons and armor and that sort of thing, and he gains levels by collecting different monsters. This does create an interesting balance here because your monsters will also gain experience and they'll gain levels as well. However, if you capture monsters, that means that experience goes to your main character and not to any of your minions. Your minions can also gain levels by you acting like a mad scientist and merging them together to form different and stronger monsters sometimes. You can also spin the monsters in order to create silk, and that's how you sell them for money. This is the only game that I've played where they actually do something like that makes sense. So instead of you defeating these random monsters and getting money from them somehow, or I guess to stick with the Pokemon thing, you beating up a rival trainer and them paying you for some odd reason, you actually have to gather like a resource and then use that for money. It was kind of a cool mechanic because you can still capture like a whole bunch of the same monster, level your character's capture level up that way, and then instead of having an inventory filled with just garbage minions, you can spin all those into silk and then sell that to, get money to get your items and your equipment and that sort of thing. For the most part, the battles in this are going to be one-on-one. You don't normally fight more than just one minion or one boss monster, that sort of thing. On occasion, you do run into 2 minions at once, and rarely you fight 3 at once. This does create a bit of a problem, but if you kind of pay attention, stick to a strategy, you can defeat them and not end up dead. Instead of having like a weapon triangle or rock, paper, scissors thing where you'll have, say, like a fire monster and that's strong against grass, but the grass monster will be strong against water, the water monster will be strong against fire, Jade Cocoon uses a 4 square model. So a water monster will be strong against fire, the fire will then be strong against air, air will be strong against earth, earth will be strong against water. I didn't really notice any like crossover between that where earth can defeat fire or air can defeat water or something like that. If it is there, I just didn't really notice it. Now, when you merge the monsters together, you can create monsters that are like multiple element types. This doesn't necessarily translate to them having, both fire and water attacks, for example, because you have to pay attention when you're really merging your monsters to what attacks they're being given. I did go out of my way to try to create a monster that was all 4 elemental types with all 4 attacks or magic spells, and that just did not work out very well. Your main character only really has 1 attack, and that's to attack with his weapon. Your monsters have your basic attack, they also have some elemental attacks they can use, and then they have spells. The elemental attacks seem to work a lot better for me, at least the monsters that I merged. They sort of did better with elemental attacks than with spells. I love the way the game looks. For a PS1 game from this time period, it looks very good. All the pre-rendered backgrounds are like really colorful and everything. They do create a bit of an issue at times where you might not see where you can go. And that can be a problem if you end up sort of just wandering around trying to find the right part of the screen where you can walk out into something else. The developers did do a decent job of kind of lighting a path for you in some places. In others, I thought the screen was a bit too dark for me. That could have been because I wasn't playing this on a CRT monitor. I was playing it on a regular TV, so Maybe that impacted just the way I could actually see everything. There are two things I want to mention when it comes to like the character sprites, or the character models. They're not really sprites in this. When you look at the people, they do kind of suffer from that lack of a facial expression that you see in a lot of PS1 games from this time. They just couldn't really do it very well, so you have kind of a neutral expression plastered on a lot of their faces. It's fine if you take into account that this game was made in 1999. That's just the way they did it back then. Now the monsters, those look a little bit rough at times, and that's just because of the time period that the game was made. They're not going to look anywhere near as good as what can be done now. I do think all the monsters look pretty unique. There are a few palette swaps, but that sort of is explained by the way they're giving you visual cues as to what the monster is. So a fire monster will usually be red, water monster blue, earth green, and air yellow. They're trying to tell you, hey, this is what you need to do if you're just not paying attention to the elemental signature up on the top of the screen. I will say the game's cutscenes, especially when they use like the anime cutscene at the very beginning to open up the game, and also when they're doing like in-game cutscenes, those all look really good for the time, especially the anime cutscene. I wish that there was more of that in the game, but there's just not. And it's kind of sad, but I understand they maybe just weren't able to do that or something along those lines. Let's get into something else that I want to talk about here. I have mentioned this already. I think the game was kind of rushed out the door. It feels like it's just an incomplete product. This is one of those games that's only on one disc, and it's only about 15 to 20 hours or so is how long the game took me to beat. Closer to 20, I think. And it just sort of felt a little empty at times. Like you really only have like 4 actual bosses in this game, and there are a lot of plot threads and a lot of stuff that just isn't really talked about as often as it should. When I looked up just how long the game took, because I was kind of interested, I saw some people say it takes 40 hours to beat this game. I have absolutely no idea how you could spend 40 hours to beat this game, because I flew through it and I wasn't rushing to do anything. And if anything, if I spent another 20 hours running around playing and just doing different stuff, my monsters would have been way overpowered. I already blew through like the final boss in like 6-7 minutes, and that was from like the very beginning through all the dialogue all the way up to the end and the ending dialogue. It did not take me very long, and I think it's because my monsters, even being at like level 22, they were overpowered for that fight. They just beat the crap out of it. So the final boss is only really 2 monsters. You have your father, Riquettes, and then you have the monster that he summons. The monster will change its elemental type, randomly almost, and you just have to keep swapping your party around in order to beat it. It didn't take very long. You beat the monster, then Riquettes is basically by himself, and you can take him down pretty easy. And then the game just sort of stops, and there really should have been more to it. It's one of the reasons why I think this whole thing is kind of like an incomplete game, or it was rushed out the door, because there just aren't that many levels for you to go through, and there aren't that many bosses for you to fight. Even with that, me saying this is kind of an incomplete game, it's still one of my favorite PS1 games. Mostly because I remember renting it. Like a lot of games back then, you just sort of took a chance on something that you saw in a Blockbuster, or in this case, a Family Video. and you brought it home, put it in your PlayStation, and that was your weekend of fun. And you just spent some time trying to figure out what was going on in the game and just how the game expected you to play it and that sort of thing. Especially with this one, since I don't ever remember seeing the instruction manual for this. I know they existed, but the copies that I own, because I have one that doesn't work and one that does, they don't have the instruction manual. When I rented the game, it didn't have the instruction manual. So it's just one of those things where if you didn't have that, you just sort of guessed and fumbled your way through it. Now with the internet, you don't necessarily have to do that, but yeah, I never really had to go to the internet to figure out what was happening in this. The game's very straightforward, and it feels kind of short for what it is. Like, you would expect it to be 40 hours, like some people on the internet think it is, but maybe that's for them going for a completionist run. Because the game does track like the number of monsters that you've captured, so in theory, you can collect them all, or at least see them all. Anyway, those are my memories of this game. I had a lot of fun playing it when I was younger. I wanted to say little, but back when I was in high school, I had a lot of fun playing it. And going back to revisit it for this, it is such a fun game to go through. It's so much more than just a Pokemon clone. And unfortunately, it gets labeled as being a Pokemon clone because of the time period that it came out. There's not really too much more to say about Jade Cocoon. It's a really fantastic game, especially when you get into it. You just need to remember it's kind of a short one, and some of the graphics suffer from the time period that it was released. So it's not going to look as good as some of the games today, but that doesn't really always matter. At the time, it looked really good, and even now, looking at the opening cutscene and looking at the pre-rendered backgrounds and everything, it's pretty great. There is a sequel to the game, which I will eventually get to at some point. It's one of those games that I have, but I never really gave it a good try. I just sort of played it for a little while and then moved on to something else. So yeah, I'll revisit Jade Cocoon 2 at some point and actually like play through it and beat it. So yeah, that's pretty much going to wrap things up. This is a great game. I hope it gets released again, or somebody picks up the IP and does something with the whole idea of Jade Cocoon, because it really does deserve it. I will talk to you all later. Bye.